Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. For several weeks, we've been teasing an episode promised to warp the mind based on the discussions we've been having recently about time, reality, and consciousness. This episode is that episode. Today, we'll explore the controversial yet compelling thoughts put forward by Donald Hoffman in his book, The Case Against Reality, and try to come to terms with how this paradigm could inform philosophy and physics in the future. So yeah, this goes really all the way back to black holes, the black holes episode, and then white holes, and then into our video podcast last week, and everything we've been talking about for the past few months.
There's a through line, yes.
So let's start with who is Donald Hoffman?
Well, Donald Hoffman is a fellow who's a couple years older than I am. He's 68, and he's a neuroscientist, a much lauded neuroscientist who's worked sometimes with a partner, sometimes with himself on notions of what constitutes reality and how we interface with it.
Yeah, and he's had a pretty interesting background because there's the psychology element, but he was also involved in artificial intelligence and some other things that you can see sort of informs and bleeds into some of his writings. So
yeah, well, this is an example of, if not a polymath, someone who's combining elements of different fields in ways that an absolute specialist might not do. At least this is all full disclosure, as if it isn't known already. This is from the viewpoint of a layperson, me, reading these books that are brain-boggling and marvelous, and taking my thoughts further and making me want to push back and all. But I think that it's evidence of what happens when you study more than one thing, find the interrelationships, and that is what freshens up a field.
Yeah, and he even sort of mentions that in the book itself, talking about how, his graduate advisor and stuff was in the psychology department at MIT, and he goes, psychology at MIT,
Yes.
that doesn't, MIT's hard science. But yeah, it is a good example of that, the cross-disciplinary aspect of how one field can lend insight into another, right? Science is not this compartmentalized, siloed endeavor, or shouldn't be, right?
Or shouldn't be. And I think he's one of those folks who's saying that it shouldn't be. And I should say, before we go any further, just as an impression, and you and I have talked of this, is that I don't have the impression that he's someone who's trying to assert the absoluteness, as if there could be, of his view. He's putting it out for testing. Maybe didn't have in mind people on podcasts talking, but as you said, he's done a number of podcasts and his TED Talk, and in which he's essentially saying, I'm taking this wild theory, which doesn't seem so wild to me, to him as the developer of it, but I can see how it might be taken that way, and I'm putting it out there, and to use the paraphrase of you put it out there as a scientist, you got a great big target on you or your theory, and then you're inviting people to take shots, and any shot that hits, well, then you readjust and rethink.
Yeah, and you and I were talking about before the show about the book itself. It's the majority of the book, a very large share of the book, is the presentation of arguments that support our current conception of reality and physics, or arguments for his viewpoint, and then counter arguments that either sort of refute the standard thinking or support an alternate view.
Yeah.
So reading the book is quite the experience, right? Because you're faced with it's philosophy, right? He's a psychologist, and it's put in terms of technological terms, in interface sort of artificial reality types of presentation, but at its core, it's philosophy, right? He's presenting arguments, he's presenting counter arguments that support, a certain view of how reality is constructed. So,
and he does one of the things. For me, it's one of my favorite things that really fine science writers do, which is to draw on cultural, literary, cinematography, cinematographic references as beginning quotations.
yeah,
So you have the epigrams and then you dive in, but you can't put those out of your head. And you come to the end of a chapter, you go back to those and say, okay, what would those to do with the piece of work? And it helps. This is a strange analogy, but it's rather like stirring a bowl of pancake batter until you get all the lumps out. And I think that doing that at the beginning of a chapter and then returning to it takes some of the lumps out.
Yeah, it was incredibly effective. I agree. Those were the most powerful parts of the book, right? It's almost like if you accidentally read those before you started reading the chapter, well, you were reading the whole chapter. You weren't stopping, because once you read them, they really hooked you into what he was going to be talking about.
I have a side question for you, but it's not really side. It goes to the matter. Have you ever read a book? I suggested this at some of my classes. I may not have to you. A book that has the epigraphs, and just read the epigraphs. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, and get to the end and say, okay, is this an outline of the book? Is this the essence of the book?
No, I've never done that.
It's a real trip. It's worth a try.
Yeah, it seems like this one would be a good one to do it with. I'll have to try it out. All right, so I think we should start with an overview of universal Darwinism. I think that's probably a good place to start in terms of providing the listeners with the foundation they need to get to where we're going to get by the end. So you want to give an explanation of universal Darwinism?
I'm in a mood today, Joel. Let's do an overview of universal. All right. So universal Darwinism would be to take Darwin's initial theory and apply it way beyond first mammalian life into all life, and then way beyond that into how physics works, into back through the very creation of things or the appearance of things. So it's to suggest that solar systems, galaxies, follow the same rules.
Yeah. And this is a topic that if you've been listening to the show pretty consistently for the past 2 or 3 months, you're familiar with it, even though we haven't used the term, because this goes all the way back to our review of Stephen Hawking and Simon Herzog's book. And it's popped up throughout the conversations since then, which is this idea, almost everybody's familiar with Darwinism, natural selection. Essentially you have things that compete, and the ones that are more fit to survive succeed and proliferate, and the ones that are not go extinct. And then through that sort of process, new things are formed, and some things are strengthened and weakened. It's this ever evolving process, and we see that very cogently, right, in animal species. But yeah, it happens in plants, and Hawking and Herzog made the argument that it happens with molecules, right? That
Yeah.
If you look at how protons and neutrons and electrons work, it's really sort of Darwinistic in how many electrons can fit in certain shells of an atom, right? And then how those things can bond at a molecular level through, the strong force or the electromagnetic force and the things that they can build on, right? So in that way, when you look at something like us, it's made out of cells, and the cells are made out of molecules, and the molecules are made out of atoms. You go, well, really, that's sort of Darwinistic, right? If each atom didn't attract a certain amount of electrons, and those electrons, those atoms didn't molecularly bond into these types of molecules, and if these molecules couldn't be used by these types of cells, and then if these cells didn't operate in this type of organ, and then if these organs didn't operate to be a body, then we wouldn't be here, right? So it's building level upon level upon level.
But I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. That's the children's repetition going up, in a story or a song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's what you just did, it marvelously, because it builds, build, grow until we become these, as we've said before, colonies. And perhaps even a galaxy. You can do biological colonies. You can do the physics, astrophysics. We're a galaxy of things. We're a collective. And if that collective doesn't function well, or we do things to damage that collective, then maybe our genes don't go forward.
Yeah.
But it's even true for language and linguistics, which is why I love it when he in some of his epigraphs, he refers to Wittgenstein and the nature of language. He's nothing in universal Darwinism, economics, sociology, linguistics, physics, the whole thing works similarly.
Yeah, and I like that he brought it up in the context of ideas too, right? He goes, ideas really operate on a Darwinistic way, because you and I sit here and talk, right? We throw ideas back and forth, and then we discuss them, and then the ideas that hold the most weight continue to go on and be put up against other ideas, and then eventually the hope is that by the end of an hour and 15 minutes that we talk, we come to the best version of an idea that we can, given that time frame. And of course, if we sat here and talked 40 hours a week as our full-time job, we'd probably come to even better ideas.
Yeah,
right?
well, perhaps. Or we're just that good. No,
right. But no, it's so that's kind of universal Darwinism in a nutshell, is this idea that basically things compete against each other, and that things that are more suited to survive continue on, and those that are not go extinct. Right?
But there's also the suggestion, because we love this word now, and this gets written into so many things, that there's an evolutionary algorithm it's hard to use the word blindly. It used to be the initial, the essential part, one of the parts of. Okay, but let's say blindly. This is an evolutionary algorithm that searches through and sorts through space to find forms that are perhaps best suited to wherever they are at that moment. There's when you start using the word algorithm, then you have to start thinking, yeah, but how did that algorithm develop? Who wrote it? And then we get into the matrixy thing that he likes to use.
Right. Yeah, and he addresses that a little bit towards the end of the book. Yeah, so I think that now that we sort of have an overview of universal Darwinism, we can ask, what is the fitness beats truth theorem?
He just uses the acronym for FBT. I'll do it roughly, and then you'll qualify it, and we'll smoothen it up. But essentially, fitness beats truth theorem, as I understand it, is that we'll stick with humanity first. we can't see reality as it is. And there's three parts to his argument. The first part is we must, or not must, we tend toward working with seeing, taking into account or creating the things which allow us to survive and thrive within our particular niches. Because you can't universalize that to all of humanity because there's so many different kinds of niches, and that's back to Darwinism. But truth, whatever truth is, would be in as he's explaining it, would be this objective reality somewhere beyond us. We're not developed to see whatever that might be, because if we did, in my interpretation of this, we'd be distracted away from what's going to keep us surviving.
Yeah. So I think that the basic tenets of the theory boil down to the fact that many evolutionary psychologists and physicists and just scientists in general, right, believe that we have some degree of veridical perception, which
I love
is
that phrase.
Yeah, which is the idea that as we've evolved as a species, we have evolved to see the truth more accurately, right? And I think that is a very easy thing from a subjective human perspective to assume, right?
Mm.
Because we look out at the world and we go, hey, look, man, we mastered this thing, right? We've built cities, we've gone to space, we've done all this stuff. How can you do all that if you don't have an understanding of what's actually there, right? And what Fitness Beats Truth says is it turns it on its head. It says, well, actually, we don't see the truth. And as a matter of fact, it's not just as if we're a little bit wrong. We don't see any of it, right? What we see instead are fitness payoffs, things that will get our genes into the next generation, things that will keep us alive as long as possible, right? Things that will feed us, that will get us mates, that will, provide us with some level of comfort.
Yep.
That's what we've actually evolved to do. We haven't evolved to see truth. We've evolved to get better on the metrics of survival. And, so a large part of the book is devoted to saying, okay, well, it'd be easy to just go, all right, well, that's your theory and it sounds kind of kooky, but whatever, we're going to stick with what science tells us. But then he actually goes through several theoretical abstract arguments for why it's not correct, as well as explaining some studies that he and his doctoral student have conducted that sort of demonstrate support for the theory. And so were there any of the things that he said that stick out to you particularly, or?
Yeah, well, I always mess this up. The Necker box?
Necker cube.
Necker cube.
Yeah.
Because it's not a box. A box is... Anyway.
Well, all information can be encoded on a 2D surface, so technically, the cube is unnecessary.
Well, that's nice to try to cover me, but no, I'm just being dense. That's one of the most compelling, not by itself. It's interesting because it's a similar kind of thing to looking at the sort of binary drawings. Is this an old lady? Is this a young woman? Mm-hmm. Kind of. And it seems to be trickery, but it's really not. It's at the core of we open our eyes, we close our eyes, we open our eyes again, we look at the cube, and the back of the cube seems to be at the front if you shade it. So shading A can be at the front, shading B is at the back, but B can seem at the front. Close your eyes, open your eyes again. But then we build into our heads, oh, I expect to see one or the other. And that's partly, I think, where he's going. If I realize that cube can look either way, and I open my eyes enough and I say, oh, I'm going to see B, then I end up seeing B more often. Now, there may be a use to that, or it may be misleading me. And there's the essence of fitness beats truth, because it's not an absolute. Fitness doesn't always beat truth. Sometimes you go toward the truth, and you get waylaid, or you get mislaid, or you don't get to the point of the survival. So that one particularly stood out to me.
Yeah. The one that I liked that we were talking about before the show was, well, it was sort of when he was describing the examples of how the experiments were conducted, which, like we talked about at the beginning, he is involved in a lot of sort of technological based things in academia. And so his one of his doctoral students developed an algorithm, right? A game sort of where they coded, life forms, right? These computer life forms with different behaviors, and then said, all right, well, go out and survive in this simulated world, right? And some of them, just had terrible coding, right? Coded to want to bump into walls or want to eat nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so those ones went extinct, pretty plain and simple. But where it gets interesting is looking at the ones that were coded, correctly, right? We'll put that in quotes for now. And then seeing how they survived, how they reproduced, how they adapted, and how they continued on. And what they found was that the organisms that saw truth went extinct, but the ones that were coded for fitness survived. And I guess when you put it that way, it shouldn't seem all that surprising, right? Because fitness is essentially the skill set of surviving, right? So if you can find food and you can sleep and you can find a mate and you can do all of these different things, then it seems pretty intuitive that you'll do pretty well at surviving. And if you become good at those things, that you continue to build on that, become better, that, okay, well, you'll continue to survive better. And so I think that the tempting conflation is to say that being good at the survival mechanisms in some way increases our ability to perceive truth. And the argument he's making is that couldn't be further from
the truth. Yeah. And what you just said, my mind, because you and I, we privilege different things in our thoughts. You're the abstract, big picture, and I sometimes think smaller picture. And that's fun. So when you were just describing that, I'm thinking, okay, yes. So remembering that fitness doesn't mean being lean and trim and muscular, and it doesn't always mean being the big Thor-like character, right? And and if we take it to sociology, and this is where I keep going into my head with his book, even though he didn't invite me to really do that. But when you talk about universal Darwinism, you're opening that door. Well, okay. So those who survive in environments, political or social environments that are deleterious to people wanting truth, those who survive are often the people who, while they may recognize the truth, have said, no, that we need to survive, so we're going to survive however we can. And truth be damned. So that's not exactly what he's saying, but it's just true. As we talk about a book like this, it's so full of thought and it's so full of examples that I can't help but go there. So, but we're not talking about truth as in right or wrong. We're talking. I think he's talking about truth as in accuracy of perception.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that is a relevant socio-political point, right? Because I think that that's something that people assume tacitly, even without evidence to support it. And I think there is plenty of evidence to support it, right?
Mhm.
That decisions made not just at an individual level, but at a collective level, tend to demonstrate a bias towards fitness and survival versus a reflection of whatever the truth of the scenario may be.
Yeah.
So can you explain how this perceptual conundrum doesn't slide into solipsism?
Well, there are some of his critics who have said that it does. When he is at his when the clarity is strongest for me in some of the passages, that it's not solipsism, because he's not saying we just see what we want to see because we need to see that, and therefore it's a closed system. It's all me, I. That he's saying there is stuff beyond. I remember one part of the book where he's talking about, oh well, I may have the car wrong, but my friend is a Maserati. He's created that out of his head, because, and we'll get to that part, right? But gee, I see the Maserati too, so I've created that in my head, so that might as well be my Maserati, because we've all created this similar icon, and so I take it, and therefore I'm right. And he's saying, no, this is not about enabling theft and unethical behavior, but it could be read that way. If somebody wanted to read that in.
Yeah, and I think that, like you mentioned, at his best, he does it. I think that it sort of obfuscates that argument that he keeps using, the example of, hey, if I see a tomato, if I close my eyes, the tomato's not there anymore, right? He keeps saying something similar to that over and over again.
Yes, he does.
So if you're not sort of intimately familiar with the whole argument of what he's trying to say, it can lead you to a conclusion that is directly opposed to what he is trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the difference, I think that where the difference comes in, right? So solipsism, this idea
being
that
totally self-centered, the whole universe is you.
Yeah, basically, I am the universe, right? And so we sort of discussed this when we were talking about Boltzmann brains, right? If we were a Boltzmann brain, that's kind of solipsism, right? Because I'm saying, okay, well, hey, Norm, you don't actually exist. Like, I'm just creating you with my mind, and I'm just creating this whole room and the whole universe. And, nothing exists except my thoughts. And so, he uses examples a lot in the book where he says, hey, there's a red tomato a meter away. If I close my eyes,
he goes to that a lot.
It's not there anymore. But then later on in the book, we say, I'm not saying that it's not there anymore. But what I'm saying is that it's not there anymore. So it gets a little slippery, but he himself sort of clarifies. He goes, it's not solipsism, right? Because I'm not saying that there isn't an objective reality. He does say that there is an objective reality outside of the subjective human perspective. But the argument he's making is that what we're perceiving is not what's actually there. And so I think that we should probably ask now, how does what we're talking about fit into the interface theory of perception? We should probably discuss that.
Right. The interface theory of perception is one of those three parts to this. Here I go. I will be so wrong about this. Interface theory of perception suggests that there is a reality, let's just take it as a fog with lots of lights in it out beyond us. I'm going to use it in my own analogy. Right? And this in part comes up in that documentary that we talked about
last
week, right? When we see just these vague shapes and lights moving around, and then they take shape into a leopard or something that seemingly we've created. Well, so we can't see things as they are. So with our limited receptors and consciousness, maybe, we create that which is necessary. So he goes to the spoon a lot as well as the tomato.
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably the easiest example is to use the one that he uses quite a bit, which is the computer one, right?
Okay. Yeah.
He says,
file. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says, when you use your computer, right? Are you actually using your computer? No, you're manipulating an interface that uses your computer. And so the purpose of the computer interface isn't to tell you the truth about the computer. It's to hide the truth of the computer in a way that allows you to actually harness the power of the computer. And so as a result, I don't have to know anything about transistors or voltage or, routings or any of that stuff in order to use a computer. All I have to do is, hey, look, here's the icon on my desktop for email. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to write out my email. I'm going to send it. And I know Norm's going to get it and he's going to send an email back and I'm going to click on that. Am I actually clicking on an email? No, because the email is nothing but ones and zeros and volts and all of these other things that a computer is made out of. So when it's put that way, that might help listeners, especially when we're thinking about the fitness beats truth theorem, right? Because I think a lot of people, and you and I were even discussing it before the show, right? Well, we can understand, why fitness would beat truth, but why does it mean that we don't see the truth, right? Why can't the two correlate or superimpose or whatever the case may be? And the case, the computer provides a good example of why that's not the case in that particular instance, right? If we were to see the truth of the computer, if I were to try to send you an email by manipulating voltage, you wouldn't be getting an email from me, right? So I need that truth hidden from me, and I need an interface put in place in order to use it. And it does. It reminds me of us talking about the documentary last week, right? Because the example that I used was that the human body, right, when we were looking at anesthesia, right? Well, we don't really know how this works, but it does. It's like the human body is this ancient alien tech, right? It's not like a car that we built and we know everything about and we can just read the user manual and figure out how to replace an engine or something. No, it's this thing that we're born with and we don't know how it operates at a very fundamental level, right? We don't know where consciousness comes from. We don't know how we think the way we do. And, as a result, would knowing the truth of how the human body works in any way help us to survive or to see reality? Probably not, because it wouldn't mean anything to us, the same way that transistors and volts and ones and zeros don't mean anything to us. What means something to us is the interface, right? The ability for me to say, oh, okay, well, when I see the wall over there, I can estimate the distance and I can estimate the material and the density and do these things in order to survive, right? To know that I'm inside where it's warm, to know that, hey, that's food that I can eat and not get sick, to know that, hey, this is a friendly person that I can talk to, rather than knowing that, hey, 90% of your body is made up of cells that aren't human. You're largely a collective organism. None of that stuff helps.
It's a really interesting, and he doesn't mention this paradigm, but the illusion of explanatory depth, which I've often talked about, is because I find it fascinating, because that's what essentially he's saying. Don't worry, we know it's an illusion. Don't worry, be happy. But it's not. Now, computer engineers, computer technologists, people who build the things, have to know how some of it works. But even they are not likely to be sitting around when they're clicking and sending emails and texts, thinking every moment how all of that's going on. But what you just said takes us. The book is addressing consciousness, and whether consciousness is exterior or interior via neurons. And in fact, what the thing about the tomato is, when he says, I'm not saying there's not a tomato there, I'm just saying there's not a tomato there, is that, of course, we need to eat the tomato or substitute your food. He's not saying we just create the tomato out of thin. We're not gods who can just whip these things up like in some science fantasy movie. But that's how our brains perceive it.
Right.
That's a really difficult subtlety.
Yeah, because and it's something that you and I are still grappling with. We were talking about it before the show, right? Okay, so there isn't a tomato there, but there is something there. And the fact that when I look at a tomato and when you look at a tomato, we see roughly the same thing. And when my cat looks at a tomato, he sees roughly the same thing, right? When you sort of triangulate or, use all of these different things to observe something, you go, well, doesn't that give us a measure of truth, right? Doesn't that tell us what the thing is? And his argument is, no, it doesn't, right? All of anything that is capable of perceiving the tomato is capable of perceiving it because it has evolved through universal Darwinism, right, to see a fitness payoff of the tomato. And so as a result, conceptions of what the tomato is going to vary from species to species. And one of the examples he uses is corophagy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Insects and animals that eat feces, right? He goes, well, heck, of course, to us humans, that's like the most disgusting thing you can possibly imagine. But if you're a pig or a dung beetle, right, it's a delicious feast. Now, is one or the other actually true? No, there isn't necessarily. There is a truth, right? But the truth doesn't matter. What matters is the fitness payoff. There is no fitness payoff for you and me, but there is a fitness payoff for a pig or a dung beetle. So the perception of what the thing is completely different.
You're giving me an aha moment of having this lowercase e epiphany, and it may well not be one. I think I'm finally getting it about the tomato. And this may be wrong, but what I'm thinking is that if we were to, so when he says we close our eyes, it's gone. We open our eyes, we create it. But we create that which is by its definable, discernible, perceivable elements with our receptors, something that we've determined can nourish us. If we saw that tomato as it really is, if we had X-rays, ultraviolet, and everything else, we might not ever touch it. It's not going to be palatable. Does that make sense?
Well, and I think probably the core point is that the tomato really only has meaning from a subjective viewpoint, right? So the idea that there's a God's eye view, that there's this thing that is the tomato, that exists, but it's not ever going to be comprehensible to humans, right? And I think that's what Hawking and Hertog were talking about in their book as well, right? They're not slipping into solipsism either by just saying, oh, well, really reality is just, whatever each individual person constructs.
No.
That is part of it, but that's not the full stop. If that were the full stop, it would be solipsism. But what they're saying is that there is an objective reality, but it's not inaccessible, but it's incomprehensible currently because we cannot divorce it from our own perceptions. And so as a result, in order to gain some insight into what is objectively there, we're going to have to go beyond our current paradigms, and particularly those of space-time, right? And now we're getting into the real weird stuff. If you thought we were already weird, we're not even there yet. But before we get to that, I think that a good segue into it is looking at what he has to say about the neuron. So what did you think of his view on the neuron? when he was having his back and forth with Steven Pinker. Do you remember it?
Yeah. I was having a rough time because, because the discussion essentially revolved around whether neurons have anything to do with consciousness or not. For a little while, it sounded like those neurons aren't really there, but I don't. and then it began to sound like, well, those neurons come to us from somewhere else, and that wasn't it. And then it was the neurons don't, and I think this is where it lands. The neurons do not generate consciousness. The neurons are objects that have a use, but consciousness is not located in them.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey, right? Because it's a back and forth between him and Steven Pinker about a book that Pinker wrote. And he admits in certain parts that he was baiting him into saying some things. And I didn't really buy this either, but trying to see what he says.
I can hear Pinker getting a little bit
exasperated.
Yes. I sent you the book, man. And now,
right. And now you're picking it apart. But no, yeah, I think that, and this again segues in, or, connects back to the documentary we looked at last week, the very first section where there was, the neuroscience there talking about, if I ask my colleagues, other neuroscientists or psychologists, where is consciousness? It's a lot of hand waving, right? Oh, well, it's in your brain. It's in your neural network. It's in your synapses. It's in your, all right. And we talked about the difficulties with that, right? Where, if we stick with a computer model for the brain, which we know isn't completely accurate, but, they'll suffice for this brief vignette. Then the human brain is much like the motherboard and the RAM and the processing, but there's no hard drive, right? There's no place where the information's being stored. And yet we have this perception of a continual self. We have memories of the past. We have conceptions of the future. We have experiences of the present moment. There's a continuity throughout time that leads us to believe there's storage of some kind, right? And so the discussion about the neuron, like you said, it went through multiple iterations over the letters, but ultimately what it came down to was, well, listen, if your view of reality is that none of the things we see are as we see them, right? And I like that you brought up the illusion of explanatory depth, because I think that it's sort of synonymous with what they were saying. I think Pinker's exact language was something to the effect of, yeah, we can see middle-sized objects with some clarity, but, once you get to the microscopic level or to the vast macroscopic level, human perception is useless, completely useless. And even the middle-sized objects, right, the things that we feel very familiar with,
the drums, the instruments, the food.
We feel familiar with them, but as you were saying before the show when we were talking about something, hey, this table is mostly empty space, right? And you go, oh, okay, so our familiarity is really
an illusion.
Quite, illusory, right? It's not actually there. And so Hoffman takes this argument to Pinker and says, okay, well, if that is your view on reality, when you come down to the neuron, then the neuron isn't really what it seems to be, right? Then we don't really know.
People who want to locate consciousness in the neuron are narrowing too far. But he says that one of the things that I chuckled at is essentially he's handing game, set, and match to Pinker in some ways, because he writes in there, he says, Steven Pinker sums up the argument well. And I think he sums it up better than Hoffman does on this particular point. Pinker says, we are organisms, not angels, and our minds are organs, not pipelines to the truth. Our minds evolved by natural selection to solve problems that were life and death matters to our ancestors, not to commune with correctness. That's pretty direct. I get that. I think, but Hoffman's going further with it, of course.
Yeah, and I think that where his ultimate beef with it ends up being is that, you know, if we sort of accept this postulation, right, that the things that we see, because I think that the point he was trying to make is Pinker and his graduate advisor and a lot of people who have given a lot of thought to consciousness and reality, most of them do so adopt at some level an interface theory of reality. You know, everybody's going to admit, right, that the things that we see are not as we see them. They're like something else. But when we get down to the neuron, there's a lot of protectivism from scientists in order to preserve a physicalist view of the human, right?
Right.
We want to be able to have some explanatory power for how a human operates. And in order to do that, we have to seat all of human capabilities within the physical being of the human.
And the function just within the being of it, thus the chemicals and electricity, that, simplifying, but it's all there. The physicalist is all, consciousness is nowhere else but here. The ghost of the I, the letter I, the ghost of the personal pronoun, is just projected by the mind in order to ensure the safety or the continuation of but it's a ghost in the machine, so to speak. But it's all of the machine.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, we're missing a big part of this. I wish that I remembered exactly the way that it went, but yeah, essentially what it comes down to, right, is that the neuron, you know, if we give the neuron special status among other aspects of reality, then that's not a really scientific way to observe it, right? We can't really just look at it and say that it's capable of doing all of these things if we can't explain how and in what ways it's capable of doing what it does.
The hand waving, say, "Oh, well, it's the neuron," and you can see as the documentary did.
And yeah, and that reminds me of the anesthesiologist talking about the paramecium, right? Because that was a great example of, here's a single-celled creature, right? And so a neuron is a single cell, right? And I think that the example that Hoffman uses is sort of as a Twitter follower, right? Mm-hmm. So you have your dendrites, which are the other Twitter people that you're following, and then your axon is your tweets, you know? And so chemical messengers and electrical impulses cause those things to work. But a single-celled paramecium, it doesn't have any neurons, it doesn't have any brain, it doesn't have anything, but, you know, it can learn and it can survive. So it demonstrates fitness-based, behaviors that allow it to continue on, that appear to be far beyond what something should be able to accomplish without any neural network, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that is sort of a strong argument for an interface theory of perception, and for the point that Hoffman's trying to make about the neuron, perhaps, which is that, okay, if we view this thing and we say that, well, this is where consciousness must be, but we know that basically neurons are kind of just on-off switches, right?
Yeah, we have no way of any test you try to do is not going to reveal consciousness in the neuron.
Right. But then you look at a single-celled organism and you see it moving around and stuff. You go, well, then our icon, right, what we perceive a neuron or a cell to be, obviously does not capture the objective reality of what that thing is, because it's operating in such a way that shows us that our icon for it is not veridical. Mm-hmm. So the question that would raise with me, right, is, so why not? Like, what is the fitness payoff for having that truth hidden from us under the microscope, right? Or is it just that we're not adapted to because it doesn't matter?
Well, I think this is what leading us back to that big question about space and time. I mean, it's not Hoffman saying space and time may be an illusion. There are a number of and we've talked about some of them, and they would argue with each other, Rovelli and the others, they do, about their conceptions or paradigms for this. But if you're saying that consciousness can't be found in something, you need to quit piloting it, like the neuron. Maybe you better be looking somewhere else. If you say space and time are an illusion, I think this interesting thing that Hoffman is working with, he's getting us toward, I think, is that space and time don't exist because the universe, as we conceive it, doesn't exist. I mean, when he talks about, well, the stars that we look at, these suns, they aren't there as suns. And you start to say, okay, this is getting really trippy. But if you go back to the idea of space and time being an illusion and consciousness is, I think he's saying that the universe is a consciousness. And I may be way off about that, but that's what it seems to be leading to. And then when someone accuses him or suggests that he's being a panpsychist, he says, this is not panpsychism because boulders and so on don't have consciousness. Well, first you hear that and you say, well, but how do you know? Especially what we're finding out about trees. Objects don't have consciousness, but they communicate. So there are a lot of inconsistencies there, at least to my dull mind. But I think the big picture is saying we don't need space and time. We are in the evolutionary process of shedding that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think that he goes out of his way not to postulate anything about what exists beyond the perceptual realm.
Right. He doesn't make a definitive statement.
Right. Only to cast doubt on our paradigm of reality, which centers around space and time and physical objects as being real and there. And that's, I think that's essentially where the argument stops for him. But as philosophers, right, that's not where we wanted to stop. We wanted to go beyond that. And I think that he does too, right? He mentions
he's inviting that.
Yeah. He mentions that, he believes that there's a way of scientifically addressing these questions and continuing research into aspects of it. But yeah, I think that, it is interesting to think about the whole argument and how it plays out. And the most relevant thing to come back to, I think, was what we talked about last week, looking at the documentary with the block, right? We just talked about a block and we said, okay, well, you can think of all of the different creatures on Earth, and so if you're a tardigrade versus a blue whale, a 12 by 12 foot cube is going to be a completely different thing in your reality. Mm-hmm. Or if you see an ultraviolet versus infrared, the color of the cube will be a different thing for you. Or if you're, depending on your ability, proprioceptive abilities, the cube may be smooth or it may be very rough. It may be very dense or very, very not dense, depending on if it's at the bottom of the ocean or at the, And so when you start to think about all of the different tangible scenarios under which a single thing could be observed by all of the creatures that are alive, if not conscious, you go, okay, well, this box can really inhabit almost any possibility you can imagine. So as a result, objectively, what is the box? Yeah. If it can be all of these things, if it's not just this 12 by 12 foot cube that we see, but if we think about it from the perspectives of all of the other things, then what is the reality of it, right? And I think that is the core argument of the book and of this way of thinking about physics, is that space and time, considered that way, doesn't work very well. And so there has to be something underneath just the spatial properties of an object that inform that reality, right? And I think that where it gets very complicated, but very cool.
Well, and doesn't he at one point, when we're at that scale, I've been reading so many things this week that I may be misappropriating this, but I think he makes response to, or makes mention of that. Well, there are galaxies and black holes.
Yeah.
Right. And so he goes to we've talked about, in the past, another one of those little clues leading up to all of this. How can that, he's essentially saying, okay, on the outside of the black hole, the cat goes in, it stretches to unrecognizable portions at the event horizon. It's just, and then it burns up as it passes the event horizon. But on the other side of the event horizon, the cat's there floating. So both are reality. Then space and time is not what we think that it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And we covered this pretty extensively looking at Carlo Rovelli's white holes and Stephen Hawking's black holes. And he recaps some of those conversations, talking about how all information can all be encoded on a 2D surface. Like 3 dimensions are not really necessary.
So there's trying to defend me earlier about that.
which is sort of the holographic view of reality.
What do you make of this when he said, in the last 20,000 years, our brains have shrunk 10%. So we've lost the volume of a tennis ball.
Mm.
How did you think he was suggesting? Because my memory is that he didn't really come to a conclusion about that. But is he suggesting that has to do with the conditions we live under now? Evolutionarily, we've dropped that because we don't need all that extra.
Yeah, I think that the argument he's making at that point was an evolutionary psychology one, stating that the conditions of modernity allow us to first off allow people to survive that wouldn't have survived under harsher circumstances. And so as a result, people that perhaps have smaller brain volumes are reproducing and are maintaining their genes, but also that in modernity, right, the conditions that we live in don't cause us to require all of the computational power we needed in order to survive.
So we're not putting that computational power to something else. The brain isn't keeping the same size, saying, okay, we've gotten you into more survivability. Oh, so we don't need this.
And you see, I think that's an interesting question that is lost to time, right? Because my guess would be that they're calculating this based off of fossil records of early hominids. But in that case, all you have is the brain case, right? You don't have access to the brain itself because the tissue doesn't fossilize. But it would be a fascinating thing to discover what parts of the brain have atrophied, right? Is it amygdala?
Is it
amygdala, cortical, pituitary areas that are responsible for fight or flight and stress and these sorts of things? You'd like to assume that the prefrontal cortex, right, what's involved with advanced thinking, has either grown or remained the same. That we probably haven't lost volume there. So perhaps we've lost volume in the occipital area, for perceptual information, right? Because we do so much perceiving in closed rooms like this versus out looking at vast horizons. There's some support for that, right? There's more people that are being diagnosed with myopia and other eye diseases than used to just decades ago. So I think that my guess would be that the shrinkage in brain volume would have to do with perceptual areas of the brain not cognitive areas. But I don't think that we'll ever have access to that information.
No, I agree with you. But you made the point in a very salient way about fossilization and what we can and cannot see. But I just had the feeling that it was too universalized. This, and I don't recall enough specificity about that, because surely in 75% of our planet, people are in constant stress just for food and to survive. So it can't be that, universally human brains are shrinking. There are enough people living in conditions for decades and decades and decades that are inhuman and inhumane. They're not going to lose their fight or flight. So I somewhere in there's a missing part that I'm.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what I think about that either, or what conclusions to draw from it.
Yeah.
I do know that there has been no demonstrated correlation between brain mass and cognitive ability. As a matter of fact, a fun fact is that Einstein's brain was exceptionally small, smaller than the average woman's, actually, which men normally have a larger brain than women's, which definitely demonstrates that cognitive ability is not correlated.
It doesn't matter.
But in Einstein's brain, his parietal lobe was much bigger than average, which is where we know much of mathematical calculations performed in males is produced. So it was an interesting section in the book, but it's hard to draw conclusions from it. The contents of the book certainly earned the dramatic title, but does the work actually make a case against reality itself, do you think?
Well, I think he's attempting a case against us thinking about reality as some certain nicely defined and boundaried zone. And he's not the first to make that case, but I think he's probably the first or one of the first to make it on such an expansive scale. As we said earlier, it's like he's putting a different collection of sciences together. I think he's making the case. Well, I can't say that parts of it are absolutely persuasive, but they are a conundrum, and they make one question, and there's much use in that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because it comes back to definitions, right? Well, what is the definition of reality, right? It might be more accurate to say that it's a case against our reality, right? Or a case against our
but that's
reality.
not going to sell books.
Right, exactly. I don't fault him. I don't fault him for the name of the book, but I think it does raise the question of what is the underlying reality, right? If we're going to posit that space, time, objects are not real, then what is real, right? And I think I do agree with you, despite his non-assertion about what that underlying reality is. I think that the indication tends to be that consciousness is the underlying reality.
I felt that often, like stepping across a big stream and hopping from stone to stone and getting my toes all wet. But I felt that that's where he was leading me. It's no, don't look over there, but but really, I mean, if you're essentially there was one part of the book where you refer to we don't even know if the Big Bang happened. I started chuckling because I'm saying, okay, so now we're back to if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there, it's not did the tree make any sound? Did the tree even fall?
Right.
How do we know it fell? Well, but it's on the ground. You see this, and this can drive you nuts. But ultimately, when it keeps going up, it sort of arrives at that expansive, the universal scale. What else would there be if there's not a reality of stars, galaxies, and gravitational forces? If all that is, and if all that is itself not an illusion, it's not perceivable by us. Well, there must be a consciousness larger than ours.
Yeah.
Or we must be part of all of that consciousness, and we don't have an individual consciousness at all. And there were some hints toward that too in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that the next logical question, right, is at its core, is Hoffman proposing a dualistic view of reality or merely a contorted one? What is your inclination there?
Well, Descartes really intrigues me. It sure sounded to me like, at least initially, a dualistic view. I don't think that he uses the word dualistic.
No, I don't think that's ever in there.
But if you're saying that the mechanism is producing illusions, and we can't measure the illusions, and we can't locate in the neurons how this all works, then it sure seems like it's a suggestion that it's past the physical, and that the physical itself is some kind of illusion. That sounds dualistic to me.
Right. I think it sort of necessitates it, right? Because if we go back to the computer metaphor, if you have the bits and the bytes and the voltages and the ones and zeros, right? And if that's the physical reality. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's our bodies and even our neurons, right? Are the computer system itself. But the interface is something that is part of that, but that hides the truth of it and instead prevents something that makes it easier to manipulate and use and harness. Then the question is, well, I guess the statement, right, is that there must be something outside of the computer system itself that has to manipulate that interface. Otherwise, the interface would be unnecessary, right?
You and we were racing to the same line there. In my head, that is why would there be an interface?
Right. If the computer was running itself, right, then it would have access to all of the things, so it would be unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And I think that I feel like that is. It seems like that should be dualism, but then when you put that back into the context,
about the contortions,
right? But if you put that back into the context of the human itself, right, and we look at it, we go, okay, well, I'm manipulating the interface, and I'm also the computer. So, am I, me, coming from somewhere else to manipulate the interface and to make the physical stuff work? Or am I just the physical stuff and it's just this strange feedback loop?
I think he doesn't know.
Right.
And I think he pretty much comes to say that. At some point he was talking about, because you and I like to talk about cats, right? So maybe we were shortchanged by evolution and lack the concepts needed to understand the relationship between brains and consciousness. Cats can't do calculus, and monkeys can't do quantum theory, so why assume that Homo sapiens can demystify consciousness? So when he says that, I think he's being playful, but he said, but we want to know anyway, right?
Yeah,
but why should we assume that we can? And also, excuse me, but why would cats do calculus? Cats can't do it because they don't have a use for it. Maybe cats can. And we don't. Have we found a way to communicate with cats to talk about their mathematical view of the universe? No, of course not. Gee, monkeys can't do quantum theory. What do we know about monkeys' senses of time? I'm sure we've determined some things through observation and experiment, but and I'm not trying to wishy-washy make it all relativistic.
No, but there's some biophysicists that have made the argument that based off of something as simple as throwing a baseball, right, you must be performing latent calculations in order to determine velocity and arc and other very complex things in order to throw a ball, but we're consciously unaware of it. Well, Now you think about a cat and all the physics that a cat does jumping around and these other things. You go, well, the cat must be performing some calculations. And
there's some sense of space and time when you're falling and you're going to land on your...
And there's a pretty high profile article probably 10 years ago now about dragonflies, right? And their ability to calculate where in space a prey insect would be in a few seconds and to make the calculations and swoop it up. And the biologists were saying, these creatures do not have the cognitive capability to perform these calculations. How do they do it, right? So we're back to the paramecium, right? Yeah. And back to questions about what the neuron is actually capable of. And what it is.
So consciousness is out there.
Yeah. So this has been a fun one. And until next time, keep pondering.